discussion segment, the front page, we'll be focusing on this matter of the Cuban medical program. So, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade, they've provided details behind the failure of the Jamaican and Cuban governments to craft a new deal for the continuation of the Cuban medical program. And the ministry did issue a statement on the weekend amid criticism that under the Holness administration, Jamaica has effectively turned its back on the Cuban people. Now, Jamaica has always valued the contribution of the Cuban medical professionals who have served our people with dedication, skill, and compassion. Those are Cuban nurses, doctors, and technicians from the neighboring island who are treated by the government of Jamaica, the statement says, with respect, care, and appreciation. It says it is widely known that the United States government has publicly raised concerns about the operation of the medical program globally, including a denial of access to travel documents, restricted freedom of movement, and salary payment matters. The government considered it necessary to review the existing arrangements to ensure compliance with the domestic and international legal obligations. Other countries in the region, the statement said, have done the same. Following the review, it was confirmed that there were no issues with treatment on the job, accommodation, leave entitlements, or freedom of movement in Jamaica. It, however, revealed two issues which required immediate attention. Among the concerns identified was the fact that Cuban personnel were not in possession of their own passports. Once that was brought to the government's attention, immediate steps were taken to correct it. The issue was raised with Passport, Immigration and Citizenship Agency, PICA, as well as the Cuban authorities locally to ensure that all personnel were allowed to hold their passports. And more fundamentally, the statement from the Foreign Affairs Ministry said the government also discovered that salary payments for Cuban medical personnel, while calculated at the same level as their Jamaican counterparts, were being made by Jamaica to the Cuban authorities in US dollars. The only payments made directly by the government of Jamaica to the personnel themselves were overtime payments. Even more concerning, there were no contractual provisions specifying what share of those salary payments was to be made to the workers. That arrangement raised serious concerns under Jamaican labor and tax laws, as well as under international labor conventions.
All right. So I told you this morning in the 6:30, it started out at 6:30, but in that segment,
yes,
that there was a report published by Cuba Archive, a free society project, entitled Cuba's Internationalist Mission in Jamaica, a troubling collaboration. And it looked at the Cuban medical and educational brigades in Jamaica and what those arrangements represent. It did say that it did not have the technical agreement between the two countries, but what it has is evidence from workers, doctors and teachers, laying out what it is the terms of their engagement are and the rules that they are forced to abide by under the program. Now, I'll summarize the summary and then we can start reading it. I want you to go to page 3, the Cuban Medical Brigade in Jamaica, where it started. That's under the heading, the Cuban Medical Brigade in Jamaica. That's where you should pick up, but just let me summarize the summary. It says, the report examines the bilateral cooperation between Cuba and Jamaica, with an emphasis on Cuba's medical and educational brigades, which is officially portrayed as internationalist solidarity, says the report. However, the documents and testimonies presented herein expose a systemic pattern of forced labor, trafficking in persons, of the Cuban collaborators, meaning the doctors and teachers, by the Cuban state with the acquiescence of the government of Jamaica. It says, despite repeated public denials from Jamaica's highest authorities, including the Prime Minister, that their government is not party to the exploitation of the Cuban workers, the bilateral agreement in education, obtained through informal channels, and the testimony of the workers interviewed for this investigation coincide with the trafficking practices intrinsic to Cuba's labor export scheme in internationalist missions all over the world. It says the investigation also describes how the Cuban mission is used to exert political influence in Jamaica. The Cuban collaborators are instructed to maintain a social media presence with content favorable to the Cuban regime and to engage in political proselytizing during elections. The Educational Brigade also uses content favorable to the Cuban dictatorship and its revolutionary leaders for instruction in Jamaican classrooms as early as grade school. And the last thing before you come in is this. Based on what the report says, and we've read all of the report, it is similar to a situation where, imagine if the Jamaican government sent farm workers to the US or Canada, and for each farm worker, the Canadian government or the US government paid their salary to the Jamaican government, and said farm worker on a Canadian farm or an American farm got overtime payments. Then they were told that not only is the government going to give us your salary, whatever overtime you work, you should send us 50% of that overtime. Show us the transfer you made, show us evidence of the transfer you made, and also you are to not do these things. Don't take up a Canadian woman, don't go to any meeting with any Canadians, don't talk to Canadian or US media. You must go to classes to discuss spreading Jamaica's good name overseas. The report
And use your social media
to support support the administration during election time. That is what this report says the Cuban workers were subjected to and have been subjected to for several cycles, starting with the medical professionals and then the education professionals. So I'm just giving a scenario to drive home the example of what the report says is happening with the workers from Cuba in medicine, in the medical field, and in education over time.
And we're going to go into some of that from the report this morning, but we're going to take a break, and then when we come back from the break, we'll delve into that. Because of the announcement from the government last week about the discontinuation of the technical cooperation with Cuba in relation to the medical program, we have here a 44-page document from the Cuba Archive, which looks at the bilateral cooperation between Cuba and Jamaica with an emphasis on Cuba's medical and educational brigades. And of course, Cuba Archive is a nonprofit organization incorporated in 2001 in Washington, D.C., whose mission is to promote human rights through research and information. Where we're going to start now in their report is to look at the medical brigade and when it started here in Jamaica. Much of our reports has said 50 years, and that is so. It says here that the Cuban health personnel first arrived in Jamaica in 1976 with the arrival of 14 doctors and nurses who went to work at the Savamar Public General Hospital. During the 1980s, bilateral collaboration was effectively put on hold. When ties were restored in the 1990s, Cuban cooperation resumed, but the exact number of Cuban personnel sent to Jamaica during that period remains unknown. In 2004, Fidel Castro and Hugo Chavez launched Operation Miracle, a Venezuela-funded initiative that deployed Cuban health professionals to perform free eye surgeries across the region. The program expanded to several countries in the region and was named, or renamed rather, Mission Miracle. From 2005 to 2010, 5,905 patients traveled from Jamaica to Cuba for surgery. This paved the way for the first bilateral agreement to establish the Jamaica-Cuba Eye Care Program, signed on July 28, 2009, and in January 2010, an ophthalmology center was opened in Jamaica.
Picking up on page 8, it says Cuba Archive does not have the Cuba-Jamaica agreement that governs medical collaboration. However, it has a copy of the contract for the provision of professional services that a doctor, anonymous source number 1, had to sign in 2018 with the Cuban state before leaving on a 3-year mission to Jamaica. It highlights the exploitation intrinsic to the export of Cuban workers by the Cuban state. The doctor, who now lives outside of Cuba, shared his copy of the document that he made by taking photos of each page with his phone. He provided his testimony to the Cuba Archive on the condition that it be published anonymously for fear of reprisals against his family on the island. He He relates that, as corroborated by members of other missions, including another doctor who was in Jamaica from 2021 to 2024, anonymous source number 2, before their contingent left for Jamaica, they congregated them in Cuba in a mad dash and did not even let them read the contract they had to sign. There was no possibility of legal advice or negotiation of the terms. Both doctors who were in Jamaica had served on previous international missions and explained that everyone always quickly signs anything they are given because they have no choice if they want to be part of an internationalist mission. Doctor number 2 remarked that nobody asks about anything to avoid being marked and lose the opportunity. He began to take photos of the contract with his phone, but was forced to delete them. Both doctors were also required to sign the disciplinary regulations for cooperators who provide services abroad, and doctor number 1 also had to sign an affidavit of what the internationalist could import, a copy of which he provided. Now, these copies of these documents are provided in the report. There's a section I read in What's on My Mind, so I just want to pick up on page 11, Tona, as in other missions in the Caribbean. See that?
I do.
All right.
As in other missions in the Caribbean, the collaborators must also remit to the Cuban government 50% of the payment for additional hours worked. According to testimonies collected by Cuba Archive and Anarela Grimmel, co-author of this report, for a piece published last April by CubaNet, the hospital pays this additional compensation in Jamaican dollars directly to each Cuban doctor into accounts in their name at NCB Bank, National Commercial Bank Jamaica Limited. The same is done with the members of Cuba's educational mission, as we'll perhaps later get to. After receiving the monthly payment, each member of the mission gets an instruction from the brigade chief informing them about the amount to be remitted or transferred to the Cuban Medical Brigade account in the same bank. The exact amount depends on the exchange rate with the dollar and is about half of the monthly salary paid by Jamaica. According to the official documents leaked to Grimmel, the Cuban mission uses an arbitrary exchange rate of 154 Cuban pesos per US dollar, which effectively confiscates additional wages as the market rate is more than double.
Doctor number 1 described the conditions the collaborators face as cruel. He joined the mission hoping to escape poverty despite being a practicing physician and to support his family. According to him, Jamaica typically sends a delegation to Cuba to interview candidates selected by Cuban authorities. Over the course of a week, they review credentials and administer basic oral and written tests involving clinical scenarios where applicants must provide a diagnosis and treatment plan. Those who pass are selected for the brigade and employment contracts and visas are issued. However, the system, he says, is not foolproof. He recalled one case in which a so-called doctor, who was also an alcoholic and knew nothing about medicine, was removed at Jamaica's request after repeated complaints. Upon arriving in Jamaica at the end of 2018, Doctor number 1 was sent to a region of the country outside the capital. His testimony coincides with that of another doctor interviewed by Cuba Archive and of the 2 health workers interviewed by Grimmel. Grimmel is the co-author of the report. The head of mission kept his official passport, which was red and valid for travel for the assigned mission. In addition to having to transfer to Cuba about 50% of what they received from the Jamaican government from their services, all collaborators were also required to remit what they received in direct payment for additional hours of work, any payments received for transformation to other locales to provide medical services, and any incentives paid by Jamaica from time to time. The member of the mission, known as the Economist, pressured them to obtain the original receipts or pay slips of payments they received directly, since she argued that copies could be altered. Nurses who were part of the mission and teaching at the University of the West Indies were forced to retroactively remit part of their earnings after the mission chief discovered they were receiving a higher salary. They were told the deductions were mandatory to help provide powdered milk and chemotherapy for Cuba's children.
Now, for the first few months, he lived with other mission members, but later moved out to gain privacy and independence. Although the housing allowance wasn't sufficient, living alone allowed him to earn extra income by working part-time privately, something prohibited by the Cuban authorities, who never found out. He quickly realized that the Jamaican government, including the immigration services, maintain a close relationship with Cuba and that much of the population holds an idealized view of Cuba, Cubans, and Fidel Castro. When their local colleagues went on strike to demand better wages and conditions, they accepted that the Cubans were ordered to continue working. Now, according to Dr. Number One, the collaborators in his region felt abandoned. They received no support from the Cuban embassy or mission officials if they became ill or faced any needs. They had no medical or dental insurance, and if they got sick, were left without medical care or medication. When a colleague developed a serious condition and needed diagnostic tests, the mission chief told them to ask Jamaican colleagues for help. Otherwise, the doctor would have to pay out of her own pocket. They also had no public liability insurance. When they raised concerns about the legal risk, they were simply told, no one's going to sue you here.
Anonymous source number 2, another doctor, started his 3-year mission in Jamaica in 2021. He was assigned to a hospital in the St. Thomas region at the foot of this page as part of the brigade of around 20 that included 12 doctors. Anonymous source number 2, a doctor, never received a contract or official document to sign from Jamaica's Ministry of Health. He confirmed that the Jamaican government usually interviews candidates in Cuba to assess their English proficiency and has specialists ask basic medical questions related to the candidate's field. During the pandemic, the interviews were conducted by video conference. He noted that Cuban supervisors sometimes sneak in friends or other favorite people with inadequate training, occasionally leading Jamaican authorities to request their removal. In his view, medical training in Cuba has declined significantly since 2007, when teaching by computer was adopted. When he arrived in Jamaica, the head of the brigade confiscated his passport. He was only allowed to carry it on 2 occasions. 1, to open a bank account at NCB, and 2, to travel to and from Cuba for his annual vacation of approximately 30 days. Several brigade chiefs, he noted the irony, did have free use of passports for their own children, whose emigration to the US they arranged from Jamaica. Although his contract said how he would be paid, he did not have time to read it properly and does not remember the stated amount of compensation. He received his salary in Cuba in Cuban pesos deposited on a card which he left with his mother. It was around 5,100 pesos a month, which today is less than $15. In those days, somewhat more. In Jamaica, he normally worked 8 hours a day from Monday to Friday, but he was not paid for that, as that was between the 2 governments. He never knew how much Jamaica paid for his daily work. He was only paid for his overtime hours, on-call duties or sessions, which he would undertake from around 4 p.m. until dawn in order to make some money. Like Dr. Number One, he was paid in Jamaican dollars directly into his bank account, but was required to remit a portion of his earnings into the account of the Cuban Medical Brigade, as instructed by his Cuban supervisor. He had to submit his original hospital-issued payslip to the brigade chief and was only allowed to retain between $800 and $1,000 monthly. He reports working 8 on-call duty shifts of 12 hours each month, totaling 96 hours, added to the standard 40-hour work week, which multiplied by 4.3 weeks per month totaled 268 hours worked per month for an effective wage in the best case of $3.72 US cents per hour when he could keep US $1,000.
We take a break and come back with more from the Cuba in Jamaica. We'll be turning now to Cuba's Educational Brigade in Jamaica. Uninterrupted cooperation in education formally began in November 1997 with the signing of the first Cuba-Jamaica agreement for Cuban teachers to teach in schools in Jamaica. In 1997, 18 teachers arrived to teach primarily math and science in high schools. The number of teachers in each time period is unknown and can only be elucidated from sporadic unofficial reports. In 2009, the Jamaican Ministry of Education decided to extend the Cuban presence into institutions of higher education, and with a revision of the agreement in 2011 to hire them for 3 years instead of 2. In 1975, it was agreed to send Cuban experts to train young Jamaicans and promote local technological development. Cultural and educational exchanges of technical and academic personnel were agreed upon, as well as scholarships for Jamaicans to study in Cuba. As part of the agreements, the Cuban regime built and equipped 4 educational centers, some conceived as boarding schools, a modality widely used in Cuba. The reportedly donated schools were Jose Marti Technical High School in St. Catherine, founded in 1977, Garv Maceo High School, located in Mape and Clarendon, founded in 1980, G.C. Foster College of Physical Education and Sports in Spanish Town, founded in 1980, and Anchovy High School in St. James, built in 1980. The latter was conceived as an agricultural educational institution, but was never used for that purpose, and instead became a military base of the Jamaica Defense Force and a reception center for Haitian refugees. In 2014, the government of Jamaica allocated 120 million Jamaican dollars to transform the Montpellier facilities into an educational center. It was officially inaugurated in 2015 with the participation of representatives of the Cuban embassy and named Fidel Castro Campus of Anchovy High School in honor of the revolutionary legacy of the dictator. Currently, there are Cuban medical and educational brigades in all schools reportedly donated by Cuba.
So, a teacher who was part of the educational mission in Jamaica in 2022, I vaulted to page 23, Tana, anonymous source number 3, has provided Cuba Archive a testimony of his experiences there. He says, I've been an English teacher in Cuba. In Jamaica, well, he had been an English teacher in Cuba. In Jamaica, he taught Spanish for 2 years at a school located more than 100 miles from the capital, Kingston, as part of a brigade of 18 Cuban teachers. He maintains there were many similar groups distributed throughout the country. As his contingent was sent during the COVID pandemic, its members are chosen only by Cuban authorities. Before the pandemic, he says a delegation from Jamaica went to Cuba to interview candidates for the educational mission. He says they signed a contract with the Cuban entity they knew as ICE, that's the Institute for Educational Collaboration, and not with any Jamaican entity. The contract stipulated that they would receive a stipend equivalent to $500 and did not define where they would work. Jamaica paid them directly in Jamaican dollars with deposits in individual accounts in their names at NCB. When they received the monthly payment, they received an orientation from the head of the brigade informing them of the amount they had to transfer to an account in the name of Cuban Educational Brigade. The collaborator provided Cuba Archive a copy of 13 such transfers he reports to have made between May 2021 and May 2022. The exact figure of each transfer depended on the referential US dollar exchange rate dictated to them and was equivalent to about half of the monthly salary paid by Jamaica of about $1,420. On average, they were allowed to keep the equivalent of $500 a month to pay rent, electricity, water, internet, and all their expenses for food, transportation, and others. Some or many ate little and poorly, often just rice, in order to save. Yeah? Many of his fellow teachers and school administrators in Jamaica knew that Cubans were required to contribute much of their salary to their government, but brigade members were instructed to justify it as a contribution to sustaining Cuba's education and health system. You know, page 27, last thing we'll say before we ask some questions. That part about when the teacher provided the testimony, you have that part? Page 27? Yeah, second sentence.
Right. So when the teacher providing the testimony left the mission, his family in Cuba was warned that he had deserted and was told to let him know that he would be sentenced to 2 to 8 years in prison if he returned to Cuba. The threat is legally supported by Article 176 of the Penal Code in force in Cuba. It's a carbon copy of its predecessor, Article 135 of the former Penal Code, which since at least 1986 penalizes with penalties of up to 8 years in prison those who abandon functions in these so-called international missions.
So there are many questions. First of all, again, we are reading for your report. We did not say we believe what is in the report. We told you where the organization was founded in Washington, D.C., and that it's headquartered in Miami. And many people say, so the Cuban dissidents in Miami, they've written a report to make the administration in Cuba look bad and to present the worst possible picture. And this is at the heart of what the U.S. is doing to break the back of the Cuban government by having these missions, these international missions ended, especially in the Caribbean, to cut off the source of revenue to the Cuban government. I mean, there are many things to draw from that. But the Wallace administration said it was negotiating to renew the agreement. Mm-hmm. Dr. Tufton told us last week that they had resolved the issue of the passports.
Right.
So no longer are the passports held by
a supervisor.
Yeah, the people who hold them one passport. That's one, which is a difference from what we are told based on the information in this report. Mm-hmm. And then the issue of payment, he says that there was a change requested to bring the payment to make it, to bring it in line with Jamaican law and international law. So okay, so those are two things. But before now, all the governments in Jamaica signed up to this agreement, knowing that the monies that they were paying to the Cuban governments weren't going to the people, and that there was a portion of additional work payments that the people had to make to Cuba. I'm asking the question. So the administration, since this thing was signed, this thing was, the medical mission started in 76. So since that time, you'd have had Edward Seaga as Prime Minister, Michael Manley, you'd have had Bruce Golding, you'd have had Portia Simpson Miller, you'd have had Andrew Holness. The government since that time, up to this point, did you know that the agreement with the Cuban medical professionals and education professionals, that the monies you were paying to the Cuban government, that these monies were not going to the workers whose sweat generated the funds that were being paid on their behalf? That's one. And then two, not before the Trump announcement that they wanted these programs ended, because of what they said was the Cuban government pressing its people into servitude. Let me use servitude, pressing their people into servitude and exploiting them and effectively engaging in human trafficking. Not before this has any government in Jamaica raised publicly any issue about the agreement with the Cuban health workers and the teachers. Why not? Did we just only discover the nature of the agreement subsequent to the announcement by the Trump administration that it wanted governments in this part of the world to end this program, and then we went and looked at the details of the program and found out that these were the details, and then we moved to change it? No, I'm not criticizing anybody for trying to fix a problem at any particular time, because problems are to be fixed. But for how long and which administrations knew that this was the arrangement, if indeed we are to believe that this administration, that these arrangements are true? And this was done in the style of a journalist, because you talk to sources who give you the documents, who want to remain anonymous, and you connect the dots from there. And there are people who've testified in this document that we have in our hand and shown the paperwork to say these are the arrangements that we were bound by, where the Cuban government is concerned and the Jamaican government was complicit. It did not say which administration. It says since 76 coming forward, Jamaican governments have known. So is it true that governments in this country have known that the Cuban government had its people under servitude and was effectively enslaving them, forcing them to work, collecting the money? When did we know this? Is a very important question. And for those who have defended the Cuban medical program blindly, did you also know that this was the arrangement, if it is that we're to take the word of cubaarchive.org? Did you know that this was the arrangement? And the statements that you've made, did you make those statements criticizing the move to end the program in full knowledge that this was the agreement that was trying to be tidied up by this administration? Yeah? That they didn't manage to tidy up? And did you criticize them for not tidying it up and continuing the program? Did you criticize them with knowledge, knowing that it was a glorified program of servitude intended to enrich the Cuban government, if we are to believe the report? And the report says in 2023 alone, based on the international missions, the people that Cuba have all over the world, $4.4 billion was collected from people working, with only a fraction of that, well, none of that going to the people, because they said that all of that came to them, and then it was the additional work, overtime or any little bonus that them get, and even
and
that,
that's all of it.
50%. Is this true? My eyes have been opened.
Likewise.
Front Page was brought to you today by ABC Electrical Sales, for a better choice in the electrical business.
You're listening to Nationwide 90 FM. The time is
8:01.
From the mountainside to seaside, countryside to townside, inside and outside, it's across Jamaica this morning.